Hello and welcome to Faces of the Main Line. My guest today is Gerry Henwood, EDD, or Dr. Henwood. She's a retired Lower Merion School District teacher, which is a very nice school district in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Hello, I'm John Ricciuti from MainlineTV.org. Gerry?
Good morning, John. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being my guest. Our subject today is very topical, considering it's post-COVID. So there are some issues that I wanted to discuss with you. But first, I'd like to ask you about, you're a retired teacher for 17 years. You were a teacher for 17 years.
I was a teacher for over 30, but 17 of which were at Lower Merion High School.
Which is a very well established high school in the suburban Philadelphia area. Mm-hmm. And I say that for our viewers that watch the show outside of the local area. What did you do as a teacher?
Well, when Lower Merion hired me in 1990, I was the first reading specialist that they had ever hired at the secondary level. And I had met a woman from the school district in a principal certification course at Penn State that we had been taking together. And she was the one who apprised me of this new position at the high school. And when I was interviewed both by the Harriton principal and the Lower Merion High School principal, a key question they gave me was, would you be more comfortable teaching in a homogeneous setting or a heterogeneous setting? And I said, well, I'm accustomed because I taught in public schools in Philadelphia, in New York, and in North Jersey, as well as in a residential home for court-adjudicated youth. I'm much more accustomed to dealing with many different kinds of students. And the principal said, oh, well, then you'd be a great fit for Lower Merion High School. And that's how I came to be there. And the first 5 years at Lower Merion, I taught students who were performing below grade level, but it was felt that with direct instruction, they could get on grade level. Now, at the point that I got my doctorate, the principal there at the time, Jack Mayer, who also had a doctorate from Penn in literacy, said, Gerry, I'd like you to teach the teachers what you know about instructional strategies that facilitate learning. And so for the next 7 years, I would go into classrooms. It didn't matter what the subject matter was. I would sit there and listen as if I were a student, and then talk to the teacher afterwards about instructional strategies that he could use or she could use in order to help students learn the subject better. Something as simple as previewing key vocabulary was something that many teachers did not do, and that would have helped student learning. I remember one history teacher in particular who gave an assignment to the students. I want you to compare Roman and Greek civilizations. Well, students don't really categorize easily. Some students do, but a lot of students don't. And after class, I went up and I said, you know, if you had said, I want you to compare these two ancient civilizations according to their religion, their education, the role of women in society, that would have given the students a better handle on how to address that. Things like graphic organizers, where they could actually visualize the information, is also something that is very helpful to a lot of students, especially since I would say the late 80s, when differentiated instruction began to be promoted, where we realized that not all students learn in the same way. So things like visualization, graphic organizers, pre-teaching vocabulary in any subject area, giving students a purpose for listening while a teacher would be instructing. All of these were strategies that I spoke to teachers about.
You just taught me a lot of things about myself that I was not aware of, and I should be more aware of them. And you also confirmed in my mind that I actually brought the right person here to talk about this very topical subject. Because as a teacher, and you still are, in my mind, I'd like to ask you how, because you seem to be so in tune, how did the COVID impact schools?
Oh, COVID has impacted schools and education dramatically. First of all, even before COVID hit, in 2010, I think it was, I saw a statistic that in Pennsylvania, they had certified 20,000 teachers to teach. Then in 2021, it dropped to 5,000 that the state had certified. So all of a sudden, we don't have teachers able to fill slots. And when COVID struck, teachers were getting sick, just like students were getting sick. Principals were getting sick. And so the schools were closed, you might remember, for months on end until they figured out what they could do in the light of this disease. Now, when students did come back to school, many teachers had resigned. They had retired, they had resigned, they didn't want to be in unsafe situations anymore. So who stepped in? Non-certified teachers, administrators, even some superintendents were stepping in to offer instruction to students. So this is one of the ways that the high degree of absenteeism that had occurred, both as a result of the disease itself, of teacher shortage caused by retirements and people just resigning. So we are now facing a crucial teacher shortage in America. And what I am very concerned about is that most people don't necessarily think that the purpose of schools originally wasn't just to teach students how to read and write. It was also to prepare them to become active members of a democratic society, that they could read and write and keep apprised of what was going on politically. And so to have schools and our educational systems subject to the kind of disasters that have occurred because of the COVID, we are at risk in terms of our democracy. The students themselves deserve the best teachers they can get. And so the government and the states have to figure out ways to address that. And some of that is happening. There have been emergency funds that have been released that are going into instructional strategies. And since students have come back, there are other challenges that have to be faced. And those challenges include a big part of being in school, namely not just learning, but socialization that occurs when students go to school and participate in extracurricular activities, whether it's sports or theater or clubs. These are all activities whereby students interact with other students and learn how to interact.
Listening to what you're saying, it sounds to me that the COVID changed the teaching process. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. At the point where I retired from Lower Merion High School several years ago, teachers at the high school level especially, who had been accustomed to working in isolation independently in their subject area, they now began to collaborate more. And that collaboration is a model that even in our career structures, they had begun to do more of. And so all of a sudden, this pandemic hits, and teachers, like students, are isolated. They're no longer able to collaborate. And instead of being in a classroom, being accessible to students, having eye contact with students, observing who's not listening, observing other aspects of student behavior that could either benefit or hinder student learning, teachers had to learn how to teach in isolation using technology. I, for one, had to learn how to use Zoom. And I began in my tutoring sessions to use the Zoom platform. But even there, I felt the absence of the personal connection. And I can observe when I'm on Zoom that students who are more adept at technology than I am, they could be sending messages to one another, and I could see a couple of the students smiling when there's no need to smile, and I know that they're not listening to me. So these are the kinds of things that have occurred. And the other thing that's happened as a result of students being isolated in their homes in Zoom classes 4 to 5 hours a day is that there has been an increase in mental health issues. I know some young people who were in 4th grade at the time that COVID hit. And the mother of one observed that her son could not focus after a certain amount of time. He was very distracted. Now, if he had been in a classroom with a teacher, that teacher might have found ways to pull him back in. But it's much more difficult when you're using Zoom to pull that student back in and to keep them engaged and participating. So as a result, there has been significant learning loss over the 2 years that we've been dealing with COVID and now going into our 3rd. I read one statistic that from 2019 until 2021, that reading scores had dropped 15% and math scores had dropped 20%. And all because of COVID.
Well, then that leads me to the next question. If it affected the teaching process, it had to affect the learning process, no?
Oh, absolutely. And here again, when you're talking about students before COVID had been assigned collaborative learning tasks because we know research has showed us, educational research, that students learn best when they are engaged with one another. And each one of us has different skills and background that we bring to a task, and they complement one another, and students can learn from one another. But that was all cut out and eliminated when COVID hit.
A local university professor said to me recently, I was having lunch with him, and he said that the freshman class following COVID was the least prepared in his 35-year history as a college professor. Mm-hmm. And he said they just absolutely were not prepared for. So that means there must have been some, are there any residual effects as a result?
Oh, yes. The residual effects that have been reported, one of them, in addition to the loss of learning, has been now that students have come back to school. The teachers have been observing that many of them do not know how to interact with students and with teachers. And so one of the recommendations is that parents can help in this way. Ask your child to participate. Choose one extracurricular activity. It could be a sport, it could be theater, it could be speech and debate, whatever they're interested in. Choose one activity, and then with that activity, don't put any more pressure on the child to resume automatically the kind of schedule that he had been accustomed to before COVID. Ease him back gradually into normalcy. And from that point of view, be patient with your child, because it's taken 2 years for all of this to happen. There could be mental issues that a child is now dealing with, in addition to the loss of learning. Schools themselves have begun to deal with the residual effects of COVID in many ways. Some are offering tutoring services. Some are offering extended day learning. Some are even extending the school year. It depends on the district. But a parent might call a school and find out, are there opportunities for learning and for their child to be seen by someone if they're having mental health issues?
Has it also been compounded by the fact that they've had 2 years to sit around with their laptop and their iPhone? It's also affected them as well. Is that a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. Because in addition to being on Zoom for classes, which they were obligated to do, a whole new approach to learning as opposed to using technology for entertainment, for activities on technology that capture their imagination, that engage them to the point where they can't even look at you and have a conversation. I have grandchildren, and they're in California. When I Zoom with them once a week, the little boy especially, who's in middle school, he can be on a video, and I'll say, can you pause that so we can talk? Otherwise, I'm not enough of a draw in comparison to the video game that he's playing to capture his attention. So that's another thing parents can do in terms of boundaries. They can try to ease back into more normal routines, like bedtime routines, which kind of went by the wayside when all of us were at home, doing whatever, being at work in our pajamas on Zoom, or things like that. Bedtimes may have been eliminated, and you went to bed whenever you were tired. So get back into normal bedtime routines. If you are trying to, as a worker, trying to get back into your work routine, talk to your child about what you're doing and model for him or her the struggles that you have and suggestions you have to help them get back into their more normal school routine. So those are some of the things.
Do you believe that there will be some children that will never recover from this? I say that because I've heard it. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. First of all, because I'm an optimist, I hate to use the word never, because you don't know when you're dealing with children what is going to become so attractive and titillating to them that even though they may have hit a plateau, all of a sudden something sparks them. It could be a relationship with somebody they admire. And speaking of that, if parents want to go the private route and hire tutors for their children, I would recommend that for an elementary school student or a middle school student, even a high school student, try to hire someone who is just a little bit older than they are, somebody who could be a mentor to them, an older student who is vivacious, that they have things in common with, that they can look up to. And if you're hiring a more professional tutor, make sure it's somebody who isn't just giving them memorization and rote learning as opposed to more stimulating engagement, somebody who's interested in learning and very positive and upbeat, in order to reinstill the joy of learning to the child.
I got a little nervous when you started to point at me. I saw the teacher come back in here. You may not feel comfortable answering this next question, and the word spectrum is my word. How do you think the COVID affected children that are, and my word, on the spectrum?
Well, there are a lot of children on the spectrum. For example, I know somebody personally who is at the higher end of the autistic spectrum, who is now a junior at the University of Maryland, gets all A's, is very verbal, and the only tinge of autism is that as a younger child, she had a lot of repetitiveness in her interactions with people, and she'd say the same thing over and over again. And as she grew socially, she didn't necessarily make wise judgments because she was kind of innocent and naive. But as a junior at the university now and 21 years old, she is a beautiful young lady with a very bright future. On the other hand, I'm sure there are not only those on the spectrum, but those who come from lower economic levels of society who have fallen farther behind than those in middle class to upper class families, where the parents might be more in tune with what to do for them instead of just putting them in front of the television. So there are those things that we have to look at. Where economically are we talking about? And if we're talking about those on the spectrum from middle class and upper class families, it's difficult, yes, but those parents probably either have the resources or can find out resources that they can tap. That's not necessarily true of the lower income spectrum of society.
Yeah, that's a very interesting and compelling response, and a very good response. Again, back to the COVID. Have schools been trying to address the loss of learning? Do you think all schools have, or have schools in general?
Well, they have, because that's their mandate. Every child is entitled to a good public education by law, and therefore school districts are obligated to do the best they can. When COVID hit, what they tried to do was protect the students with separating the desks, with more frequent hygienic cleaning, putting those plastic barriers up, requiring students to come to school with masks, as well as the teachers, during the passing of classes, staggering the number of students in the hall. So they were doing things like that. And I'm sure that in regard to counseling and tutoring and the kind of extracurricular activities that they're offering, they're doing the best they can under the circumstances I mentioned earlier, with shortages of teachers. And that extends to bus drivers. That extends to coaches of sports teams and sponsors of extracurricular activities. So I don't know how long it's going to take to get back to normalcy.
Then I guess that leads me to the next question, which you referenced regaining home life, bedtime hours, and probably eating, at time of eating, probably everybody ate whenever they felt like eating or didn't feel like eating. How do parents help their children regain their sense of social and academic normalcy then? Because I guess you have to do the home thing first, or unless you can do them both at the same time.
Well,
and this requires, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this requires more from parents who are probably have their own jobs and were used to the school regimentation.
Yeah, well, I want to comment on some initiatives I've been made aware of recently that are going on in Philadelphia. There are new designations of schools called community schools, and parents are having a greater input into the life of the school in terms of volunteerism, in terms of contributing money that might make up the budget difference, where a school might have to lay off art and music teachers. The arts usually are one of the first things to go. And
Sure.
so I was made aware of this from my own sons, who both reside in California. Their children go to public schools, and yet each of the families is assessed so much additional money per year, which shocked me. I said, what is that money for? It's to provide for an additional psychologist, or it's to provide for an additional music teacher or a music teacher. And so the contribution of money, number one, even in a public school setting, if the parents can afford it, usually fleshes out a restricted budget that a school district might be experiencing. But then the parents themselves go in and volunteer. So that's one thing. The other thing that's going on, and I was made aware of this through a friend who is a professor at the, St. Joseph's University, and who has
in Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia, and who has a collaborative relationship with St. Gomper School in Wynwood, or right across the City Line Avenue, that because of the teacher shortage, they are taking aides in the classrooms, and it's a program called Grow As You Go. And they're taking those people and providing them with the apprenticeship training that will enable them to competently step into a classroom. So things like this are going on. And as far as the parents, to get back to them, again, if they could call the school and find out, are there programs that their children could take advantage of in any of the categories that we've mentioned, whether it's academic tutoring, whether it's mental health issues and counseling. So those are the things that I would recommend.
Do you, and this is something that just occurred to me. I'm hearing from several parents that their freshman student has dropped out of college. And do you think that's a result of some of the things reflective of COVID? The freshmen, one actually was in her third year. Do you think that had an effect on it, or do you think college just isn't for every kid?
I think both. I think college isn't necessarily for every kid. And being as old as I am, historically, I remember, and I'd like to bring this up because as I was preparing for this interview, I couldn't help make this comparison. Back in 1957, when Russia put Sputnik up into space, our government was concerned about our keeping up with Russia. And when I graduated high school in 1960, one of the ways that I got to college was taking advantage of a government loan called the National Defense Education Act that gave students money, low interest loans, to go to the university because they wanted to get more competent and teachers. And there was a teacher shortage supply as well because we were the baby boomer generation. And I went to college then, partly because of a scholarship and partly because of the NDEA loan that I received. And I started teaching in the mid-60s. And so this was a response to that challenge of Sputnik and making sure that our democracy, our country, stayed right up there with Russia. And in a way, COVID has been the next significant challenge. And the government is releasing money that's going into school districts to help school districts overcome the challenge of the pandemic. And how districts use that money is up to them.
Well, you were just a terrific interview.
Thank you.
And your teaching skills came out because you were probably a terrific teacher, and
Thank
you
you.
still are.
Thank you.
And you're a face of the main line. With Dr. Gerry Henwood, former Lower Merion Township school teacher. This is John Ricciuti. I hope you enjoyed the show and found it very educational, informative, and entertaining. Thank you, and have a good day.